right, we're going to start with a real upper today. Child mortality rates.
Woof, love it.
Nothing like starting out a podcast with child mortality rates. They're honestly, they're kind of heartbreaking to talk about, but it's one of those things that's kind of going on, quote unquote, behind the scenes for a lot of people who are in high income countries. That there are a lot of middle and low income countries struggling with this still. And a lot of people don't know the long run story. So there's also some new data out in the US that we're going to talk about towards the end. But first, I want to talk a little bit about this long run story. I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago in the newsletters. So if you read the newsletter, this is a little bit of a recap of that. So a lot of people don't know that worldwide, the child mortality rate, in this case, meaning children who die before the age of 15, we're going to narrow that down a little bit further as we go along this data, has dropped dramatically. Even in 1950, globally, the rate was 27%. So 1 out of 3, basically, kids would die before they reach 15. Now it's a little bit over 4%, which is amazing.
That's much higher in 1950
yep.
than I actually would have thought. Although I guess that's a product of, it's a global average, right? So it would have averaged really high mortality rates like parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, and with less high mortality rates.
Exactly. It is a global average. So you do have some really high ones bringing it up and some really low ones bringing it down. But you might be fascinated by this as well, Zachary, which is that the mortality rates for kids in 1950 in Europe, the countries today with the highest mortality rates still, so it's mostly sub-Saharan Africa, other places like Pakistan, their rates are better than the European ones in 1950. So all over the place, we have been making progress.
And this recalls the late, great Hans Rosling's inequality of various sorts within countries maybe getting worse, but between countries is getting better, meaning there's a convergence of positive outcomes globally between countries that you kind of don't notice because we focus so much on some of the dynamics within countries.
Yep, 100%. And a lot of these, technological breakthroughs and sort of infrastructure, or I shouldn't say infrastructure, systems that work well in high income countries do eventually get into the low income countries as well, which is it's a matter of speeding that process up. So I wanted to highlight that because our World in Data did an update of their child and infant mortality page. So that's one reason. And the other reason was because the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has this report every year called the Goalkeepers Report. They keep track of the SDGs, which we've talked about before on this podcast, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set in 2015 to improve the world by a lot of different measures by 2030. And their report, the Gates Foundation report, I think came out over the summer, and I didn't mention it very much at the time, but it's a good time to mention it now because of their focus on under 5 mortality rates and neonatal mortality rates, insofar as their progress towards the SDG targets in 2030. So under 5 being the number of kids per 1,000 live births who die before they reach 5. Neonatal is within 28 days. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, and their report brought this up over the summer, is that there are actually 2 targets amidst many others that we're not doing so great on. There are actually 2 targets where we are within shooting distance of reaching them by 2030. So the 2030 targets for the under 5 mortality rate, we want to reach 25. So 25 kids per every 1,000 live births. And neonatal is 12. If the Goalkeepers report says that if our current progress stays the same in 2030, we'll end up at 29 for under 5 mortality and 14 for neonatal, but that there is a possibility that this progress could accelerate.
The bigger picture in behind the very specific numbers, of course, is we're doing a better job of taking care of life, full stop. And that has been part of the arc of the past 200 years, right? One of the really animating features of science and medicine for the past 200 years has been to end as much as possible early and promiscuous death. And that's part of the reason why the population of the planet exploded from 1800, where it was a little less than a billion people, to close to 8 billion people now. And yeah, that created all sorts of pressures, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, as supply chains and food chains and all of that had to adjust to a massively different demographic globally. But if you look at the arc of medicine as founded on this principle of we should prevent as much as possible death that is preventable, we could have a whole other discussion about some of the problems of contemporary medicine in treating death full stop as a pathology, rather than allowing for the fact that as much death as we may prevent, we're not going to prevent death. Well, I mean, unless you talk to a few Silicon Valley billionaires who are actively engaged in that very pursuit, right?
Or Walt
But
Disney.
that's been a really exactly. It's hanging out somewhere in cryogenic bliss, ready to be defrosted, at which point he will go, wait a minute, this is not the world I thought I was going to wake up into. Put me back. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely been, we should celebrate that has been a massive, unequivocal success of a human endeavor that animated people from almost every culture around the world.